Jake Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished repairing another broken air filter in the lower maintenance tunnels of Celestial Station. At 17, he had been working these shifts for almost 2 years now, ever since his parents died in a transport accident and left him alone on humanity's biggest space station. The work was hard and dirty, but it paid enough to keep him fed and housed in the cramped quarters assigned to junior maintenance staff. Celestial Station was unlike anything most humans had ever imagined when they first dreamed of reaching the stars. The massive structure stretched for miles in every direction, with spinning rings and interconnected modules that housed over 2 million beings from 43 different alien species. Each species had carved out their own neighborhoods and districts, creating a complex maze of different cultures, customs, and social rules that even the station's computers struggled to track. The humans lived mostly in the central hub, where the administrative offices and main docking bays were located. They were still considered newcomers by most of the older galactic civilizations, even though humans had built and operated Celestial Station for the past 15 years. The other species tolerated human presence because they needed the station's services, but few of them showed any real respect for humanity's achievements. Jake had learned early on to keep his head down and do his job without causing trouble. The maintenance tunnels took him all over the station, giving him glimpses into the lives of dozens of different alien species. Some were friendly enough, like the six-armed Kalari who always nodded politely when he passed by. Others, like the tall and proud Zenthari with their blue skin and silver eyes, barely acknowledged that humans existed at all. But it was in the hydroponics bay that Jake first noticed something that would change everything. The bay was one of the largest areas on the station, filled with growing towers that reached up toward artificial sunlight. Plants from 100 different worlds grew there, providing food and medicine for the station's diverse population. The air always smelled green and alive, a welcome change from the recycled atmosphere in the maintenance tunnels. That's where he first saw Lyra. She was probably close to his own age, though it was hard to tell with alien species. Her people, the Ethmari, were humanoid but taller and more slender than humans, with golden skin that seemed to glow softly in the artificial sunlight. Their eyes were larger than human eyes, colored in shades of amber and gold that seemed to shift and change like liquid metal. What made Lyra different from other Ethmari was the intricate pattern of scars that covered the left side of her face and neck. The scars formed complex geometric designs that looked almost like writing, with curved lines and sharp angles that created beautiful but alien patterns. Jake later learned that among the Ethmari, these scars were sacred markings that showed Lyra was training to be a spiritual guide and healer for her people. Each scar had been carefully created during religious ceremonies, marking important moments in her spiritual development and her connection to the ancestral spirits that the Ethmari believed watched over them. To her own people, Lyra's scars made her beautiful and holy. To almost everyone else on the station, they made her a freak. Jake first witnessed the bullying during his 3rd week of working near the hydroponics bay. A group of young Zenthari cadets, probably military trainees based on their matching uniforms, had cornered Lyra near one of the growing towers. The Zenthari were naturally taller and stronger than most species, with proud bearing that made them natural leaders and warriors. These particular Zenthari seemed to enjoy using their size and status to intimidate others. "Look, it's Scarface again," their leader called out, his voice carrying the accent of the Zenthari upper classes. "Why don't you cover up that ugly mess? You're scaring the plants." The other cadets laughed as Lyra tried to move past them, but they kept shifting to block her path. Jake watched from behind a maintenance panel, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to help, but he had been warned repeatedly about getting involved in conflicts between alien species. Humans were supposed to stay neutral and avoid taking sides in interspecies disputes. But what made Jake's stomach turn was not just the cruelty of the Zenthari cadets. It was the way that dozens of other beings, from multiple different species, simply walked by and pretended not to see what was happening. They followed the unwritten rule of non-interference that kept the peace on Celestial Station, but that also allowed bullying and harassment to continue unchecked. Even the human security guards who occasionally patrolled the area would look the other way when they saw alien-on-alien conflicts. The official policy was to let each species handle their own social problems internally, rather than risk creating diplomatic incidents by interfering. As the days passed, Jake began to pay more attention to Lyra and the way she was treated by others. He noticed how she moved through the station with her head down, trying to avoid eye contact with most beings. He saw how she ate alone in the communal dining areas, sitting at tables far from the social groups that formed naturally among the different species. But Jake also noticed things that others seemed to miss entirely. He saw the gentle way Lyra cared for the plants in the hydroponics bay, talking to them softly in her musical native language. He watched as she carefully tended to sick or dying plants, somehow nursing them back to health with techniques that the human botanists didn't understand. Sometimes he heard her singing while she worked, her voice creating haunting melodies that seemed to make the very air around her shimmer with emotion. Most importantly, Jake saw the sadness in Lyra's golden eyes, a deep hurt that never quite went away even when she smiled. He began to realize that behind all the scars and alien features was someone who was just as lonely and isolated as he was, someone who deserved kindness and friendship but received only mockery and indifference from the beings around her. Unity Day was supposed to be the one time each year when all the different species on Celestial Station came together to celebrate their shared existence in space. The main plaza had been decorated with colorful banners and flags representing every civilization that called the station home. Food vendors from dozens of worlds set up stalls selling exotic dishes, while musicians and performers from various species entertained the crowds with songs and dances that most beings had never seen before. Jake had been looking forward to Unity Day for weeks. It was one of the few times when his maintenance duties were light, giving him a chance to explore the station and maybe even talk to people from other species without worrying about work schedules. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, he might get a chance to actually speak with Lyra for the first time. He had been watching her for months now, wanting to reach out but never finding the right opportunity or the courage to approach her. The plaza was packed with thousands of beings from every corner of the galaxy. Tall, graceful Valdorians with their crystal-like skin mingled with the furry, bear-like Garati traders. Small, quick-moving Pixeli darted between the legs of the massive, rock-skinned Baldurians. The air buzzed with dozens of different languages and the excited chatter of beings enjoying a rare day of peace and celebration. Jake had been wandering through the crowds for about an hour, sampling different alien foods and watching the cultural performances, when he heard familiar voices that made his blood run cold. The same group of Zenthari cadets that had been tormenting Lyra in the hydroponics bay had found her again, and this time they had chosen the most public place possible to continue their harassment. Well, look what we have here, called out their leader, a particularly tall and arrogant Zenthari named Kextar who seemed to take special pleasure in making others miserable. It's our favorite scarred friend, trying to blend in with civilized beings. Lyra had been standing near one of the food stalls, probably trying to buy something to eat, when the group of 6 or 7 Zenthari cadets surrounded her. She was holding a small credit chip in her hand, but now she clutched it tightly as she tried to figure out how to escape from the circle they had formed around her. Maybe she's lost, suggested another cadet, grinning cruelly. These marked ones don't usually leave their little garden hideouts, do they? The Zenthari were speaking in Standard, the common language used throughout the station, which meant that everyone around them could understand exactly what was being said. Jake watched in horror as more and more beings began to notice the confrontation, forming a larger circle around the scene but making no move to intervene. I think she's trying to pretend she belongs here, Kextar continued, his voice getting louder and more mocking. But look at that face. Those disgusting scars make her look like she was attacked by some kind of wild animal. No wonder her own people sent her away to live on this station. Jake knew that wasn't true. He had learned enough about Ethmeri culture to understand that Lyra's scars were religious markings, not signs of exile or punishment. But most of the beings watching didn't know that, and some of them began to nod along with the Zenthari's cruel words. Lyra tried to push past the cadets, moving toward what looked like an opening in their circle, but they quickly shifted to block her path. Her golden eyes darted around desperately, looking for any way to escape, but everywhere she turned there was either another Zenthari or a wall of silent spectators who refused to help her. Please, Lyra said quietly, speaking in her accented Standard. I just want to go back to my quarters. Oh, it speaks. Kextar laughed, and several of the other cadets joined in. Tell us, Marked One, do you really think any being would want to look at that ruined face of yours? Even the humans, who are supposed to be so accepting and friendly, must find you repulsive. That comment hit Jake like a physical blow. The Zenthari was using humanity's reputation for tolerance and diversity as a weapon against Lyra, suggesting that if even humans found her ugly, then she must be truly hideous. It was a calculated insult designed to hurt both Lyra and any humans who might be listening. The crowd around them had grown to include at least 100 beings from dozens of different species. Jake could see Valdorians, Kalari, Pixeli, and even some of his fellow humans watching the scene unfold. But nobody moved to help. This was exactly the kind of interspecies conflict that everyone had been trained to avoid. The unofficial policy was clear: each species should handle its own problems, and outsiders should stay out of disputes that didn't directly involve them. Jake watched as Lyra's shoulders began to shake. Her head dropped down, and he could see that she was fighting back tears. The proud, graceful being he had admired from afar was being systematically humiliated in front of hundreds of strangers, and nobody was willing to lift a finger to help her. "Look, she's going to cry," one of the cadets pointed out gleefully. "Maybe the tears will wash off some of those ugly marks. Or maybe they'll just make them look even worse," suggested another. That's when Jake saw something that broke his heart completely. Lyra lifted one hand to touch the scars on her face, not in pride or defiance, but in shame. For just a moment, she seemed to see herself through the eyes of her tormentors, and Jake realized that their constant harassment was starting to make her believe that she really was ugly and worthless. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle but unwilling to intervene. Some beings were whispering to each other, commenting on the situation as if it were entertainment rather than cruelty. Others looked uncomfortable but still made no move to help. A few human security officers were visible at the edge of the crowd, but they remained in position, following orders not to interfere in alien social conflicts. Something deep inside Jake's chest felt like it was burning. This wasn't just about following rules or maintaining diplomatic neutrality. This was about a person being hurt and humiliated while hundreds of others watched and did nothing. This was about the difference between what was legal and what was right. Jake had spent his whole life being careful, following orders, staying out of trouble. He had learned to keep his head down and avoid making waves because that was how humans survived in a galaxy full of older, more powerful civilizations. But as he watched Lyra's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, something inside him finally snapped. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears as he pushed through the crowd of aliens. Most of them were taller than him, and he had to squeeze between beings who smelled of strange spices and chemicals he couldn't identify. His maintenance uniform was dirty and wrinkled compared to the fancy clothes that many of the other species wore for Unity Day, but he didn't care about that anymore. "Hey!" The word exploded from his throat before he even realized he was going to speak. His voice cracked slightly, making him sound younger than his 17 years, but it was loud enough to cut through the cruel laughter of the Zenthari cadets. "Back off." The jeering stopped instantly. Kextar, the lead Zenthari tormentor, turned slowly to look at Jake with an expression of amused surprise. The alien was at least a foot taller than Jake, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of military training. His silver eyes glittered with malicious entertainment as he looked down at the young human who had dared to interrupt their fun. Well, Kextar said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "The human speaks. How unexpected." He gestured grandly to his fellow cadets, who were now all staring at Jake with various expressions of curiosity and contempt. "Look everyone, we have a hero among us. A maintenance worker, no less." Jake could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward him. The crowd had grown even larger now that something truly unusual was happening. Interspecies romantic relationships were rare enough on the station, but public confrontations like this almost never occurred. Most beings prefer to avoid conflicts that might create diplomatic problems or social complications. The silence stretched out like a physical thing. Jake could hear his own breathing, could smell the fierce sweat on his skin mixing with 1,000 different scents of the alien crowd around him. Somewhere in the distance, the Unity Day music was still playing, but it sounded muffled and far away, like it was coming from another world entirely. "Tell us, maintenance boy," Kextar continued, taking a step closer to Jake and using his height advantage to loom over him. "Do you find this scarred creature attractive? Is that why you're so eager to defend her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Jake knew that every being in the plaza was waiting to hear his answer. He could see some of the human security officers at the edge of the crowd, their hands moving toward their communication devices, probably calling for backup or instructions on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Jake's eyes found Lyra through the circle of Zenthari cadets. She was staring at him with her golden eyes wide with shock and fear. Her hand was still pressed against the scars on her face, as if she was trying to hide them from view. She looked so small and vulnerable surrounded by the much larger Zenthari, and Jake realized that she was probably terrified of what might happen to her if this confrontation escalated. For just a moment, Jake felt his courage waver. He was just one human teenager facing down a group of trained military cadets from a species that was stronger and more aggressive than his own. The smart thing to do would be to apologize, back down, and let the station security handle the situation through proper diplomatic channels. But then he looked at Lyra's face again, saw the shame and pain in her expression, and knew that he couldn't walk away. Not when someone needed help. Not when he had the chance to do something right, even if it was dangerous. Jake squared his shoulders and walked straight toward Lyra, ignoring the way the Zenthari cadets tensed up around him. Some of them moved as if they were going to block his path, but Kextar held up a hand to stop them. The Zen-3 leader seemed curious to see what the human would do next. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something historic was about to happen. Jake could hear whispered conversations in dozens of different languages as beings tried to guess what the young human was planning. Some of the whispers sounded worried, others excited, and a few seemed almost angry that a human was daring to interfere in alien affairs. When Jake reached Lyra, he stopped just inches away from her. She was trembling slightly, whether from fear or emotion he couldn't tell. Her golden eyes searched his face, probably trying to understand why he was risking himself for someone he barely knew. Very gently, Jake reached out and placed his fingers under Lyra's chin. His touch was soft and careful, more gentle than anyone had probably touched her in months. Slowly, he lifted her face so that she was looking directly at him instead of staring down at the ground in shame. "You want to know what I see?" Jake said, and his voice was stronger now, carrying clearly across the silent plaza. He wasn't talking to Kextar or the other Zen-3 anymore. He wasn't even talking to the crowd of watching aliens. He was talking directly to Lyra, speaking to her like she was the only person in the entire station who mattered. Jake leaned forward, and before anyone could react, he pressed a soft kiss to one of the sacred scars on Lyra's cheek. Then another kiss, to a different scar near her temple. Each kiss was gentle and reverent, treating her markings not as disfigurements to be hidden, but as something beautiful and precious. "I see the most beautiful person on this entire station," Jake said, his voice ringing out clearly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the plaza. The collective gasp that rose from the crowd sounded like a wave crashing against the station's hull. In all the years that Celestial Station had operated, no human had ever shown such open, public affection to an alien. Interspecies relationships existed, but they were usually kept private, conducted away from the judgmental eyes of the various alien societies that still looked down on such connections. But Jake had just kissed an alien girl in front of hundreds of witnesses from dozens of different species. He had declared her beautiful when others called her ugly. He had chosen to stand with her when everyone else, including his own species, had chosen to remain silent and safe. Lyra's golden eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of shame or pain. For the first time in months, maybe years, someone had seen her scars as something beautiful instead of something to be mocked or pitied. The moment Jake's lips touched Lyra's scarred cheek, everything on Celestial Station changed forever. Within minutes of the confrontation ending, dozens of beings were pulling out their personal recording devices and uploading footage to the station's internal networks. The videos spread like wildfire through the communication systems, jumping from one species' social platforms to another until nearly everyone on the station had seen what happened in the plaza. Jake barely remembered walking away from the crowd after his bold declaration. The Zen-3 cadets had been too shocked to respond immediately, and by the time they recovered their composure, station security had finally moved in to disperse the gathering. Jake and Lyra had slipped away in opposite directions, both of them overwhelmed by what had just occurred and unsure of what would happen next. Back in his small quarters in the maintenance sector, Jake sat on his narrow bed and watched his personal communicator buzz constantly with incoming messages. Some were from fellow humans who had heard about the incident, others were from aliens he had never met who wanted to share their opinions about what he had done. The messages ranged from supportive to angry to completely confused, but they all had one thing in common: everyone on the station was talking about Jake Thompson. The Valdorian news networks were calling it an unprecedented display of interspecies affection. The Kalari information feeds described it as a violation of established social boundaries. The Pixeli gossip channels were having a field day, analyzing every second of the recorded footage and speculating about what it meant for human-alien relations on the station. But it was the reactions from his own species that surprised Jake the most. He had expected the human administrators to be furious with him for creating such a public spectacle and potentially damaging Earth's carefully maintained diplomatic relationships. Instead, many of them seemed proud of what he had done. Commander Rebecca Hayes, the station's chief human administrator, summoned Jake to her office the morning after Unity Day. Jake spent the entire walk through the administrative corridors convinced that he was about to be fired, maybe even deported back to Earth. The commander's office was intimidating, with its polished metal desk and walls covered with certificates and commendations from various alien governments. "Sit down, Thompson," Commander Hayes said when Jake entered, but her tone wasn't as harsh as he had expected. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s who had been running human operations on Celestial Station for over a decade. Jake had only seen her from a distance before, usually when she was meeting with alien dignitaries or giving speeches at official ceremonies. "I suppose you know why you're here," she continued, pulling up the now famous video on her desk screen. Jake watched himself kiss Lyra's scars again, feeling his cheeks burn with embarrassment at seeing his private moment of courage replayed for what felt like the millionth time. Yes, Jake replied quietly, preparing himself for the lecture about diplomatic protocol and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries with alien species. Instead, Commander Hayes surprised him completely. That was either the bravest thing I've seen a human do on this station, or the most foolish. Possibly both. She leaned back in her chair and studied Jake's face carefully. But I'll be damned if it wasn't exactly what needed to happen. Jake blinked in confusion. Oh. Do you know how long I've been watching other species treat each other with casual cruelty while we humans stand by and do nothing? Commander Hayes asked. We built this station to bring different civilizations together, but we've been so worried about offending someone that we forgot about our own values. You reminded everyone what humanity stands for, treating all beings with dignity and respect, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. The commander stood up and walked around her desk to face Jake directly. I'm officially commending you for upholding the best traditions of human compassion and courage. This goes in your permanent record as a positive achievement, not a disciplinary action. Jake felt like he was dreaming. Thank you. I just couldn't stand watching her get hurt anymore. That's exactly why you did the right thing, Commander Hayes replied. Now get back to work. And Thompson? Don't let this go to your head. You still have maintenance duties to perform. But the ripple effects of Jake's actions were spreading far beyond the human administration. The Zenthari cadets who had been tormenting Lyra suddenly found themselves facing uncomfortable questions from their own superiors. The Zenthari military prided itself on honor and strength, and many of their senior officers were embarrassed that their junior cadets had been caught bullying someone weaker than themselves. Kextar and his friends were quietly reassigned to different duties, away from the public areas of the station where their behavior might reflect poorly on their species. Other Zenthari began approaching Lyra to apologize for their fellow citizens' actions, something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. More importantly, beings from other species started questioning the unwritten social rules that had allowed such harassment to continue unchecked. The Valdorians, who valued artistic beauty above almost everything else, began to reconsider their assumptions about what made someone attractive. The Kalari, with their strong sense of community, started organizing support groups for aliens who had been isolated or mistreated by their fellow station residents. Meanwhile, Lyra had been searching for Jake ever since the confrontation in the plaza. It took her 3 days to work up the courage to approach him, finally finding him during one of his shifts in the hydroponics bay where they had first noticed each other. Thank you, she said simply, speaking in her accented standard. Her golden eyes were bright with unshed tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. You don't need to thank me, Jake replied, setting down the irrigation control he had been repairing. I should have said something sooner. I should have helped you months ago. Lyra shook her head, touching one of her scars gently. In my culture, these marks are sacred. Each one represents a life I helped heal, a spiritual connection I made with someone who was suffering. But here on the station, everyone sees them as ugly wounds. Everyone except you. Over the following weeks, Jake learned more about Ethmeri culture than any human had ever known before. Lyra taught him about the religious ceremonies where her scars were created, the years of training required to become a spiritual healer, and the deep connection her people felt with all forms of life in the universe. In return, Jake shared stories about Earth, about human history and the struggles his species had faced to reach the stars. Their friendship deepened quickly into something stronger and more meaningful. They began spending their free time together, exploring parts of the station they had never seen before, trying foods from different alien cultures, and learning to communicate in each other's languages. But perhaps most importantly, their relationship inspired others to cross the invisible barriers that had divided the station's communities for years. Humans began forming friendships with aliens they had previously avoided. Members of different species started sitting together in the dining areas and working on joint projects. The rigid social hierarchies that had kept everyone separated began to soften and change. Jake Thompson, a lonely maintenance worker who had simply decided to do the right thing, had started a revolution of kindness that was transforming Celestial Station into the truly unified community it was always meant to be. 3 months had passed since that fateful Unity Day when Jake had kissed Lyra's scars in front of hundreds of watching aliens. Life on Celestial Station had settled into a new rhythm, one where humans and aliens mixed more freely than ever before. Jake had been promoted to senior maintenance technician, partly because of his excellent work record, but mostly because Commander Hayes wanted to reward the young man who had become an unofficial symbol of human courage and compassion. Jake and Lyra had become inseparable during those months. She had taught him basic phrases in the Ethmeri language, while he had shown her how to repair some of the simpler systems that kept the station running. Their relationship had blossomed into something deeper than friendship, though they were careful to respect the cultural differences between their species. Lyra's people valued patience and spiritual connection above physical attraction, while humans tended to be more direct in their approach to relationships. But it was during the third month that something happened that would prove once and for all what Jake had seen in Lyra from the very beginning. The crisis started in the Draknari sector, one of the most isolated parts of the station where the reptilian Draknari people lived in carefully controlled environmental conditions. The Draknari were an ancient species, proud and secretive, who rarely interacted with other beings on the station. They kept their sector sealed off from the rest of Celestial Station, maintaining their own atmosphere and temperature controls to match their desert homeworld. When the first Draknari became sick, their leaders tried to handle the situation internally. The Draknari medical system was advanced but specialized for their own physiology, and they were reluctant to ask for help from other species. But within days, the illness had spread to dozens of individuals, and then hundreds. The Draknari doctors were baffled by the disease, which seemed to attack the nervous system in ways they had never seen before. What made the situation truly terrifying was when the plague began jumping to other species. A Kalari trader who had visited the Draknari sector became ill with similar symptoms. Then a Valdorian diplomat, then 2 human technicians who had been working on the sector's air filtration system. The disease was unlike anything the station's medical teams had encountered, and it seemed to adapt itself to attack different alien biologies in different ways. Dr. Martinez, the station's chief medical officer, called for an emergency quarantine of the affected sectors. Panic began to spread through the station as beings realized that this mysterious plague could potentially kill anyone, regardless of their species or natural immunities. The station's hospitals were overwhelmed with patients, and the medical staff was running out of ideas for how to treat the rapidly spreading disease. That's when Lyra approached Dr. Martinez with a request that surprised everyone. She wanted to enter the quarantine zones and use her Ethmeri healing abilities to help treat the sick. Dr. Martinez was skeptical at first, having little experience with alien spiritual medicine, but he was desperate enough to try anything that might help. Jake insisted on accompanying Lyra into the quarantine zones, despite the obvious danger to his own health. "We're in this together," he told her when she tried to convince him to stay safe in the uninfected areas of the station. "I'm not letting you face this alone." What happened next would become legendary throughout human space and beyond. Lyra entered the makeshift hospital wards where dozens of beings from multiple species lay dying from the mysterious plague. She moved from bed to bed, placing her scarred hands on each patient's forehead and closing her golden eyes in deep concentration. The scars on her face and neck began to glow with a soft, warm light that seemed to come from within her skin itself. Jake watched in amazement as the intricate patterns of her sacred markings pulsed with energy, channeling some kind of spiritual power that human science couldn't explain or understand. Patient after patient began to recover under Lyra's touch. The plague symptoms that had baffled the station's best doctors started to fade as her healing energy worked its way through their systems. But the process was exhausting for Lyra, draining her own life force to save others. After each healing session, she would collapse from exhaustion, and Jake would help her to a quiet corner where she could rest and recover her strength. Dr. Martinez and his medical team studied Lyra's healing techniques carefully, trying to understand how her abilities worked. They discovered that her scars weren't just decorative markings or even simple religious symbols. Each scar was connected to specific nerve pathways and energy channels in her body, creating a biological network that allowed her to sense and manipulate the life force of other beings. The Ethmeri healing tradition was thousands of years old, passed down through generations of spiritual guides who dedicated their lives to serving others. Each scar on Lyra's face represented years of training and sacrifice, proving her dedication to the healing arts. What others had seen as disfigurement was actually a sophisticated medical technology that combined biology, spirituality, and advanced understanding of life energy. Word of Lyra's miraculous healing abilities spread quickly through the station's communication networks. Beings who had once mocked her scarred appearance now waited in long lines outside the medical centers, hoping for a chance to be healed by the young Ethmeri woman they had previously treated with contempt and cruelty. The Zenthari cadets who had bullied her months earlier were among those who came seeking her help when the plague reached their sector. Kextar himself appeared in the medical ward, his proud bearing replaced by humility and desperation as the disease ravaged his own body. Lyra healed him without hesitation, showing him the same compassion she offered to everyone else, regardless of how they had treated her in the past. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Commander Hayes arrived at the medical center with a delegation of alien ambassadors and government officials. They had come to witness firsthand the healing abilities that were saving hundreds of lives across multiple species. When they saw Lyra working tirelessly to heal beings from the same species that had tormented her, channeling her own life energy through the sacred scars that others had called ugly, they finally understood what Jake had seen from the very beginning. The plague crisis lasted for 2 weeks, during which time Lyra saved over 300 lives from 17 different species. Her healing abilities proved crucial not just in treating the sick, but in developing new medical techniques that could be used by conventional doctors. Dr. Martinez and his team learned to recognize the energy patterns that Lyra could sense, allowing them to create new treatments based on her spiritual healing methods.